Thank you. Thank you. Good morning and welcome. My name is Bill Salmon. I do work at the Hill, and I so appreciate you all coming out here on this ridiculously cold morning in our nation's capital to join us for this really important program. You know, here's a statistic that kind of amazes me. 1 in 4 Americans is a family caregiver. What do I mean by family caregiver? I mean someone who is helping an aging parent or spouse or any other loved one with a disability to live as independently as possible. And that entails a lot, right? I mean, because family caregivers end up managing everything from meals to doctor's visits to bill payments. And by the way, they're doing this while they are also simultaneously juggling their own day jobs, they're raising children or whatever else they've got going on. So as a result, they have not just all of the normal responsibilities of their lives, they now have taken on these added unpaid responsibilities. And by the way, some of the, caregivers end up shelling out about $7,200 per year on average out of their own pocket. And that can be a significant chunk of a caregiver's income. So you end up sort of placing a strain on their financial security, just as they're, like all of us, facing, it's not cheap to buy groceries or electricity or healthcare or a lot of other stuff. So today we're going to really get under the hood and examine some of these fundamental questions about family caregiving, starting with what is the financial toll? And I'm talking about not just on families, on the broader national economy. What about the role of the caregiver? How has that evolved over the last decade or so? And then there are employers. How can employers best support our caregivers? And finally, we're going to talk a little bit about tax incentives and credits and whether those can make a meaningful difference, or whether we have to talk about sort of broader systemic reforms. Luckily, we have lined up some really smart people to answer these questions today. I'm talking about lawmakers from both parties, advocates, experts on family caregiving. They're going to help us understand how best to support the millions of Americans who make independent living possible for loved ones every single day. So we hope you can follow along the conversation on social media and use the hashtag #TheHillHealth. That's hashtag #TheHillHealth. We want to take a moment to thank our sponsor, AARP, for their very generous support in making today's program possible. You know, I turned 66 last week, so I'm officially an old person. And I got to tell you, the more I learn about AARP, the more I am absolutely convinced it is just an amazing institution. So huge shout out to AARP for their partnership. Now, today is what we call here in D.C. a fly-in day, which means that the members of the House of Representatives are flying in throughout the day so that they can get down to work a little bit later. And as a result, the first couple of interviews are taped, but they're really good. And then we'll have some live interviews for you. So the first interview is going to be with Republican Congresswoman Kat Kamak of Florida, who happens to be the co-sponsor of the Alleviating Barriers for Caregivers Act. So she's obviously a key player. She's going to be interviewed by Kathleen Koch, who's a contributing editor at The Hill. So we hope so much that you enjoy the conversations today, whether taped or live. And again, thank you so much for coming out on this very cold but beautiful morning.
Welcome, Congresswoman. Thanks so much for joining me this morning.
Absolutely. Great to be with you.
I think we all have caregiving stories, right? My mom, for instance, cared for my dad for decades before he passed away from Parkinson's. So how has the caregiving issue impacted your family as well as the way that you approach this topic?
Well, it's pretty interesting how so many people find themselves in caregiving positions without really any warning in some cases. I can say predictably being a caregiver as a mom now to a 3.5-month-old has certainly helped shape my perspective. But also, as a millennial, I'm, in the position where we're dealing with aging parents and some of the health challenges that come there with that. And so for my husband and I, we're in the middle of that sandwich generation where we have young children in the home, but also aging parents. And that has really been the introduction that I have had in the caregiving space. And as we've been going through it, starting to, help navigate what resources are out there, I'm starting to find more and more gaps. And you start talking to people, whether it's providers or fellow caregivers, and you're starting to see, there's a lot of work that needs to be done here. And so that's what's keyed us in on this issue so far.
It's a job that many people take on it's very suddenly and unexpectedly. What do you think that people most misunderstand about the reality of caregiving today?
Oh, I mean, I would say it the fact that there's 1 in 4 Americans today that act in the capacity as a caregiver, and yet it is one of the most under-resourced and really not discussed topics, certainly on Capitol Hill, is a sign that something is really, really amiss. The other thing that I think people think of when they think of caregiving just at large is they think it's, oh, maybe an occasional thing, like, hey, I check in on this person every now and again. No, it can be an all-consuming day and night endeavor. And it depends on really what the situation is, but every situation is unique. And what I have found is I all of a sudden have to become an expert in navigating CMS. Now, thankfully, from my perch on the subcommittee on health, I was able to, jump in and really start to understand some of the things a little bit more readily than maybe some of my counterparts would have. You all of a sudden have to become an expert on navigating our broken system. And I've referred to our system as sick care rather than health care because 9 times out of 10, we're focused on maintenance rather than prevention. And that's very, very frustrating. And then you sometimes have situations and I think a lot of people run into this, where there hasn't been any planning involved. So you're dealing with powers of attorney, fiduciaries, getting set up for being able to be an effective caretaker actually takes a lot of work. It's not just, hey, I'm going to sit here, I'm going to show up one day and sit with this person for a few hours and everything's going to be okay. It is a massive life-changing endeavor. And I think that's why this moment right now that we have with some eyes and on the caregiver space as a whole is a really unique one for us to make some substantial changes to make life a little bit easier for those that need caretaking and those that are the caretakers themselves.
So, speaking of substantial changes, you have introduced the Alleviating Barriers for Caregivers Act. So, tell us what that would do and how it would help caregivers.
Well, our bill, the Alleviating Barriers for Caregivers Act, the ABC Act, it simply says that agencies have to go through and streamline resources and eliminate red tape as it relates to caregiving. This is important because anybody who's ever had to deal with a federal agency knows that they would probably rather pull their fingernails off with a pair of pliers than deal with any federal agency because it is horrible. They're not really in the business of customer service, we'll say. And so this would really be an important step in helping caregivers who already have a pile of things on their shoulders already, just taking some of that paperwork burden and streamlining resources. That's a huge help because not only is it an emotional and physical toll for caregivers, but then you are completely emotionally draining. And so this is a good first step, but there's a lot more that we have to do in this space. But I think the bipartisan nature of the ABC Act is a good first step in really reorienting federal resources to a new reality, like I said, that 1 in 4 Americans face every single day.
Now, I noticed that it does seem to have a lot of support on both sides of the aisle. Where does it stand? Are you anywhere close to getting a vote?
Yes, so it's working its way through committee. And of course, we know that we have our Senate counterparts that are moving this along as well. At the end of the year, politically, everything starts to, kind of get jiggled around. And all of a sudden, it's like, oh, now we're moving. So we're excited that there's going to be some forward moving progress on it here in the next few weeks.
How else can Congress ease the financial pressure on family caregivers? Are you, for example, a fan of tax credits?
Yeah, I think President Trump has kicked around the idea of offering tax credits to caregivers. I think I saw a number about $7,500 is what is out of pocket for some of the caregivers today. I personally will tell folks that I have seen not only in my personal case, but in many of my friends who are, again, of that sandwich generation, taking care of young kids and then aging parents or grandparents. It's much more than that. And what I've seen is there's really a system of people who maybe have done well in terms of saving. The resources out there are so expensive that it becomes virtually impossible for the person needing services to do it. So you have a double whammy of both the caregiver and the recipients of care. They're just financially getting drained. So tax credits, I think, are something that would help, certainly. And I know President Trump has been very, very supportive of exploring that. And I think you'll find bipartisan consensus for that as well. But I do think that there needs to be a conversation largely about the affordability of services in general. And we see, of course, shortages in different spaces such as nursing and clinicians and other spaces that drive up the cost. We have to do a much better job of looking at this entire environment holistically rather than just trying to pinpoint and put band-aids on little pieces here and there, because it's all tied in so tight together that we have to really do a deep dive into the system as we know it.
I'm wondering in particular about, say, rural areas. Your district, I think, is largely rural, so accessing healthcare and transportation, in particular, for caregivers, that can be even more difficult in an area like that. What solutions do you see for caregivers in rural or medically underserved communities?
Well, right off the bat, obviously, telehealth is a huge, huge option and a blessing in many cases. With that comes some unique challenges. For the longest time, broadband connectivity was a struggle. We're finally seeing some breakthroughs with BEAD money hitting states and the build out for the infrastructure taking place. And in many cases, the rural co-ops have stepped up in significant ways. In my district, I'll speak to Central Florida Co-op, just as an example, in Swanee Valley. They have now started to deliver the final mile, that last mile of connectivity, as part of their services, which for a long time, rural co-ops weren't stepping into the broadband space. But I think everyone collectively realizes today, if you don't have access to high speed, affordable, and reliable internet, you're behind. And that is for healthcare, that is for education, that is for commerce, that is for everyday life. It's not just about streaming Netflix, right? It's about having that access and that connectivity. That's critical. So we're continuing to see the build out of broadband around rural America, which is going to greatly increase our ability to reach people that really need these services the most. And I will again say it's not just going to be for the healthcare for people that are in need of care, but for the caregivers themselves. The mental strain that many people feel, I think, needs to be talked about a lot more. And I do think that telehealth can provide some flexibility, but also access to caregivers who are needing some emotional support. So that's a huge part of it. The telehealth, that is a big part of it. But then again, we talk about transportation. Um, I know of countless families, particularly that are taking care of veterans in their household. Um, the VA for a long time was saying, "Oh, as long as you're within X number of miles, as the crow flies, you can access services at this location." Well, okay, as the crow flies, that might be 20 miles, but that could be an hour and a half in some cases because you're on a two-lane country road going around all sorts of places. And so I think the deployment of continuing to put VA clinics in rural America, for example, is a good answer. But rural transportation is a very, very big issue. And particularly as we're talking about those that may not have, they may have mental or physical issues that are preventing them from being their own, being able to actually drive to go seek care. That's where we have to have a conversation about access to transportation. So I think in the upcoming surface transportation bill, you're going to be seeing a lot of investment into infrastructure that's critical for that. But again, I think that telehealth is going to be the fastest way that we address some of these gaps.
You talk all the time, I'm sure, with businesses in your Florida district. So, what are employers telling you about the growing caregiver pressures on their workforce?
Well, I think there's a big difference between a major, Fortune 500 company being able to prioritize and offer flexibility options like, remote work or teleworking versus a mom and pop operation, which may not have the flexibility in order to say, hey, yeah, you're the front desk person. You can't really be the front desk person from behind a computer screen. And so I think we need to have an option for businesses that meets them where they're at. Government is infamous for one size fits all approach when it comes to business as a whole. But as I said, a Fortune 500 company may have options and flexibilities that your mom and pop operation that employs maybe 5, 10, 15 people doesn't. And so again, I think that tax incentive should be there in ways that really support small businesses that are trying to support their employees, because there's a lot of flexibility that's required when you're a caregiver. And so I think that that's something we need to explore potentially in a Reconciliation 2.0, which has been talked about on Capitol Hill quite a bit. I think that this, again, is the moment where we have an opportunity to really help support small businesses, particularly when they've got employees that need those flexibilities without hindering them in terms of productivity.
Is this in particular a tough issue, really important issue for your state? Because Florida has the second largest population of seniors in the country, more than 7 million, right?
Yeah, it is. It is a huge issue for Florida for a number of reasons. I mean, everyone, when they think of Florida, they think, yes, this is the retirement state, and we've got folks from Naples all the way, and of course, to the villages, which if you've never been to the villages, it is a sight to see. And it is a huge part of Floridian culture, the retirees. But one of the challenges that we have here in Florida is over 1,000 people a day moving to the state, putting pressures on our infrastructure systems. And when you think about housing, for example, I can't tell you how many folks and constituents that I have that have moved here from other states. And, we have a very favorable tax environment here and a lot of policies and politics that people like. So they move here from other states, but what they're doing in the process is sometimes they're leaving behind their support structures. And so I have heard countless times from folks, hey, we just moved to Ocala, but my daughter and her family, they're out in California. They're trying to move here, but it is so expensive. There's just the houses, every time they put in for a house, it's snapped up with a cash only offer, the day that it goes up on the market. The housing shortage issue, the inventory or lack thereof, is a real issue in places like Florida and Texas. So talking about this having a more broad look at caregiving, it's not just, hey, we're going to talk about this one issue or that one issue. It is all encompassing, from our broken healthcare system and the culture around that to really changing the culture of being customer service oriented with the federal agencies to infrastructure for broadband so we can get telehealth and we can make sure that there's rural transportation options for folks. But then again, housing. No one ever talks about housing and the housing shortage and inventory challenges and affordable housing as part of the conversation around caregiving. And it's something that, when you start talking about it, you're like, oh yeah, that makes sense, but it's never been a part of it in a meaningful, deliberate way. And so we've talked at length about what does that look like for caregivers and relief for caregivers in the state of Florida. We're talking about property tax relief. There's actually a proposal that will be introduced I believe in March of next year, when the session gets underway in Tallahassee, that will eliminate property taxes for seniors. That would be an incredible gift in terms of some financial breathing room for people who are needing assistance. And I just think that there's a lot of things that are happening in this space, but everybody's kind of in different directions. That's honestly what I'm hearing from my constituents, is just the things that no one really is talking about: the housing shortages, the affordability issues. It all kind of ties in and compounds into a tough situation for caregivers and those receiving care alike.
A lot of work to be done on, as you said, a very complex issue. Congresswoman Kat Kamak, co-sponsor of the Alleviating Barriers for Caregivers Act. Thanks so much for joining us.
I appreciate it. Have a good one.
You too.
Now for the Democratic point of view, Kathleen also sat down with Congressman Tom Suozzi from New York. He is the lead sponsor of the Well-Being Insurance for Seniors to Be at Home, or WISH, Act, and a member of the House Ways and Means Committee. Take a listen.
Good morning, Congressman. You've been active for years on caregiving and long-term care, but before we dig into the specifics, tell us why you're so passionate about the issue.
Well, thanks so much, and good morning to everyone. It's a big issue to me because of my personal life. You know, I grew up in a house. All four of my grandparents lived in my house growing up, and three of them were very sick. And one with Parkinson's, one with dementia. They called it senility in those days. One with cancer. And they all lived into their 80s and 90s. My mother was a nurse, and she did a lot of the caregiving. But I was, a young kid in high school taking my grandmother to the bathroom. I mean, you can imagine what that was like. And my parents didn't really want us to have the same burden that they had taking care of their parents. So my parents bought long-term care insurance. And I lived in the same hometown as my parents, and as well as my in-laws. And my father lived till 95. He died at home with home health care aides. And my mother lived until she was 93. Again, she died a year after my father, but she had home health care aides as well. And home health care is a great thing to have, but most people just can't afford it. It's just too expensive now, because when people like my parents bought long-term care insurance, the insurance companies didn't take into account that some people would live a lot more than a year and a half after they couldn't do their activities of daily living, and they lived for 10 years, 15 years, 20 years, and it broke the bank, and the insurance companies lost their shirt. So now long-term care insurance is unaffordable for most people. And we think we need to address that because we have a big storm coming in our country right now.
Well, Congressman, on that point, I know you are addressing it because you are the lead sponsor of the Well-Being Insurance for Seniors to Be at Home, or the WISH Act. So how exactly would that work? How would it help older Americans and their caregivers?
So right now it's a bipartisan bill with 3 Democrats and 3 Republicans. And the big idea behind it is that we need to create a marketplace where the public sector and the private sector work together. And we want to inspire or encourage the private sector to provide affordable long-term care insurance and to have an incentive to go out and sell it to everybody. Right now, 4% of Americans have long-term care insurance.
Not much.
Not many people want to talk about what it's like to get old and you can't, feed yourself or go to the bathroom yourself or get out of bed yourself. But nobody wants to talk about dying either. But brokers are out there selling life insurance like crazy, and 60% of Americans have life insurance. So we need to replicate that so that the whole private sector of insurance brokers are out there selling long-term care insurance. But they have to create affordable products that will actually help make people's lives better, and that will incentivize these brokers to go out and make some money by trying to sell the stuff. So what did we do? We created in the WISH Act the idea of catastrophic care, which is that if you live for more than 18 months after you can't do your activities of daily living, your family and you have to take care of that yourself if you're in the lowest 50% wage earners. If you're in the highest 50% of wage earners, you've got to take care of yourself for 3 years. If you do that, then catastrophic coverage will kick in from the federal government. We'll pay you $3,600 a month to help pay for your long-term care for the period post 18 months or the period post 3 years, depending on your income level. And the idea is by doing that, we take the burden off of the insurance companies so they'll be falling over each other to create affordable long-term care insurance products for that first 18 months or for that first 3 years, depending on your income level. And they'll be,
So do insurance companies support this idea?
yeah, they do. As do the Center for Aging and different senior advocacy groups. We're building a broad base of public sector and private sector folks that see this problem. What's the problem? Every day, 10,000 people are turning 65 years old. All the baby boomers. I'm near the tail end of the baby boomers. I'm 63 now, so I'm going to be aging to 65 in a year or two. And in, I think it's 6 years, there'll be 8,000 people turning 80 years old every day. So one of the biggest causes of homelessness, new homeless people in America, is a woman turning 80 years old because they don't have the financial wherewithal to take care of their long-term care and to deal with the different issues related to aging. So we've got a real storm coming in our country. And if we try and put everybody in nursing homes, 2/3 of the people in nursing homes are paid for with Medicaid, it will bust the system. We don't have enough money to pay for it in Medicaid. We don't have enough beds in nursing homes. And it's just not a great way for people to age. It's better to age at home with long-term care assistants or family members helping you. And to do that, we need to create systems that will help to support that. And the WISH Act, by taking off this tail end catastrophic care piece and putting it on the federal government, will incentivize the private sector to create affordable long-term care insurance products and go out and sell it to people. One of the things we're working on is how do we get the federal government to educate people about long-term care? Well, that's a nice idea, but the federal government's not really that good at doing stuff. Let's get the private sector out there encouraging everybody. Let's have them do commercials on TV and say, hey, what are you going to do? Dad's getting old. What are we going to do to take care of him? Well, do they have long-term care insurance? You better get long-term care insurance. So we need to encourage people to do that.
So, Congressman, an AARP survey did find, you're pretty on target here with 75% of seniors preferring to stay in their own homes as they age. Yet most states, some 38 of them, spend the majority of their long-term care dollars on institutional care and not home care. So beyond what you're doing, do we need a fundamental reorientation in how we think about care?
Yes, we absolutely do. And to do that, we need to get people talking about long-term care. And again, it's not a comfortable topic. Like, it's not comfortable to talk about dying. And a lot of people don't have those conversations about dying. But insurance brokers are out there talking to people every day. They're knocking your door. Hey, did you ever think about what you do to pay for this if this happens? And they're skilled at it, and they do it every day. And 60% of Americans have life insurance. We need to create the similar dynamic with long-term care insurance. But my sister is a Unitarian minister. She went to Harvard Divinity School. And one of her missions was to get people talk about what it's like to age, what it's like to die. To talk about, are you prepared? Have your assets in order? Do you have what's called a do not resuscitate? Do you have orders for your doctors? Do your kids know what you want? How are you going to pay for your funeral? It's very hard to convince people to talk about these aging and end of life issues. And it's not going to happen because Tom Suozzi says it's a good idea, or Kathleen says it's a good idea, or the federal government runs some commercials. That will never solve the problem. This has to become a part of the fabric of America. And one of the things to make things part of the fabric of America is to create a financial incentive for it. And that is to create these insurance companies to go out and sell long-term care insurance. But nobody's going to buy it unless it's affordable. So we need to create affordable long-term care insurance products.
So, Congressman, if this passed, so would this fully then alleviate the financial strain of caregiving? Because I know you've heard the same stories that I have about caregivers who have had to deplete their life savings or leave the workforce in order to care for family members.
That's, can I tell you, it's such a big issue, not only for the seniors that are aging and can't take care of themselves. In my family, I told you my story. We're kind of like throwbacks in that we had all four of our grandparents living there, and the kids were nearby, and the parents were nearby to take care of. Well, what is it now? People live longer, they have less children available to take care of them, and the kids move all over the country. And how many of us know a story of a friend or a relative or a coworker is like, oh, my mother's, I don't know what to do. I have to go back home. This has a big drain on the economy as well, because people have to leave work, as you said, to go back and take care of their parents. Think of all the anxiety that it causes for people in their lives. What am I going to do? I got to take care of my kids. Now I have to take care of my parents. They call it the sandwich generation. We call it the panini generation because it's like, cheese and messy and stuff. So we have to figure out how we can get in this contemporary age with people living longer and a lot of them and less people to take care of them, not enough beds in nursing homes, not enough money to go around in Medicaid. Long-term care is much less expensive and it will make people's lives better in the process if we can create a vehicle by which we get more people to buy long-term care insurance or to take care of themselves and then have the federal government take care of this catastrophic care. Now, the question is, how do we pay for the federal government's catastrophic care piece?
That's what I was going to ask you, sir, because this does not sound like an inexpensive, item.
No, it's going to cost billions of dollars. And originally, we had wanted to do a payroll tax deduction. So add 0.25% to your Social Security tax, for example, something like, that idea, not specifically that. We may want to tie this to Medicare, actually. But I knew that if I did that, I would never get any Republicans to co-sponsor my bill. So what we're doing now is we have some actuaries working on seeing how much money this would save Medicaid. If we took this burden off of Medicaid and people in nursing homes, how much money would that save? And then look at different ideas, like one of the things we're talking about is negotiating prescription drug prices. Well, let's take the savings from the negotiating prescription drug prices and invest it towards this catastrophic care portion of the bill. I'm certain, but I have to get it documented by the actuaries, that this is a net positive economically for America. Not only the productivity gains of people not having to leave the workforce to go back home, not only the not putting people in nursing homes and the savings that it would cause by not using Medicaid for nursing homes, but also just by the relief of the stress and anxiety that exists in society.
So you think that we may find that the cost of not acting, it would be greater than the cost of passing this measure and offering this to
There's no
people?
there's no question in my mind that if we do nothing, we're in for a big problem. And it's all based upon the baby boomers. The baby boomers are aging out, and they are all. Some people are in great shape, but most people are not in great shape, and I'm talking about financially. And we have got to figure out how to create these affordable solutions to this problem.
Where does the WISH Act stand right now? And what can those who are watching us, who may want to help push it forward, how can they get involved?
We need more groups to endorse the WISH Act. We have 3 Democrats and 3 Republicans that are co-sponsoring it now. I could get a lot more Democrats, I think. I want to get Republicans, and we want to kind of do a Noah's Ark 1 for 1. And there's so much going on in Washington, D.C. these days. I don't know if you've been reading the papers, but it's hard to break through on any issue. And we are speaking to groups like yourselves and other groups on a regular basis. We just did a conference with Tom Harkin with his Aging Institute the other day. Just try to slowly build support. And anybody who's watching this who thinks, wow, that sounds like a pretty good idea, we need you to reach out to my office to give us your support, see if your group can help us, and help me to identify other members of Congress that you think would be interested in supporting this effort, because we need to get more members of Congress. Every time I tell the story, people say, oh, yeah, my mother, my grandmother, my cousin, everybody's got a story like this. So we've got to figure out how to take that lived experience of most people we know and turn it into support for a piece of legislation like this.
So, Congressman, is there any way then that would this measure benefit, say, employers if this passes, or should they be taking other steps to help support caregivers?
No, employers should love an effort like this, because they are dealing with the lived experience of people who have to leave work to go take care of their parents. I mean, that's just a very real experience that's happening every day. And large employers are very much affected by this. Small employers, everybody's affected by it. Everybody, if you just talk to people, you will find out that they are dealing with this issue as time goes on.
And that's what I was wondering as we wrap. What are you hearing from your constituents on this? Could you share with us a story?
I'm hearing the same as you're hearing, stories of people having this experience. And it's usually a woman, quite frankly. It's not always a woman, but women are often more in this position where they're not living in the same town that their parents are, and they got a phone call from their parents or from an aunt or an uncle even, and they don't know what to do, and they get off the phone and they talk to me or they talk to a friend, and they say, "Oh boy, I'm really worried about my mother. I don't know if it's safe for them to drive. I don't know, what happens if they fall." Who's going to help them with XYZ? I may have to leave my job. I may have to go back home. I may have to move my parents out here. And it's often overwhelming for people that they can't afford it. They can't afford to leave their jobs. They can't afford to deal with it. And they don't necessarily want to have to deal with having their parents move in with them or them moving back home to live in with their parents. So we have to try and find the middle ground. Under this bill, we're asking people to take care of their parents or themselves for the first 18 months when they need help with their activities of daily living. Well, that could either be you do that with your family members, you muddle your way through, you use your money, or you buy long-term care insurance. So you have home health care aides that will come and take care of you for that 18 months or for 3 years if you're a wealthier person. So we're not wedded to a final piece of legislation exactly the way this is. We'll take any suggestions anybody has, but we've been talking about this for about a year and a half. Nobody has come up with a better idea yet. And we're completely open-minded as to what to do. But we have got to deal. We have to, number one, recognize this is a very real problem in our country that's getting worse. And number two, this is a practical solution to try and address it. And let's try and pull together and try and make it happen.
Congressman Tom Suozzi, Democrat of New York, and the lead sponsor of the WISH Act. Thanks so much for joining us today.
Thanks, Kathleen.
Now, please welcome Kathleen to the stage, joined by caregiver Gary Kaligas from Shreveport, Louisiana, for a personal perspective.
And Gary, welcome. Thank you for making the trip all the way up from Louisiana to share your story.
Thank you. I'm glad to be here.
Yes.
Kathleen.
So we're going to talk about your family and you being a caregiver. So your dad, I understand, died in around 1987. Your mom really wasn't prepared.
No, she was not.
And she didn't know how to drive, couldn't cook, couldn't pay the bills, didn't know how to run anything in the household. So you're an only child. You stepped in
I did step
and
in.
started doing everything for her while at the same time helping raise, your own 3 kids. So talk to us about what that was like, how emotionally draining and financially.
Well, initially it was not as bad as it could be. Luckily, her needs were not that complex. So taking care of my mom, she was 69 and I was 37, I had to juggle family responsibilities with her responsibility and help teach her. So, but after year, it was 28 years of caregiving.
Wow.
So the initial years were, again, easy. But then it got more complex. Medical issues happened. She had cancer. She had debilitating falls. She had other healthcare issues that required me to intervene. Luckily, my wife helped, but I'm the only child, so there's no other relatives in town, so I had to take care of her, arrange for all these doctor's visits. And this was the 80s. Well, there weren't as many resources. We didn't have the internet back then. You had to make those telephone calls and make those appointments and wait on the line to make sure that you can get her in, and et cetera. So it got more and more complex as the years went on. And then it got extremely more complex when we had to deal with moving her from her home to independent living and eventually to nursing home care.
As you look back, what would you say was the greatest challenge that you faced?
I think the greatest challenge was when she was hospitalized and bringing her back to either home and independent living and arranging for care for myself, for her through myself, as well as other independent caregivers. I mean, it was costly. And I ended up having to pay probably $7,000 or $8,000 out of pocket of my own cost and pulling out of her small savings that she had. So it was depleting our particular aspects of my own family, but also her. But juggling the responsibilities of family, dealing with my mother was another major challenge.
So were you working at
I
the
was
time, and
full-time
was
working.
your employer sympathetic?
My employer was quite sympathetic and understanding, but back in the 80s and 90s and even early 2000s, my employers understood caregiving, but I don't think they understood it to the nth degree to help the caregiver, to help the individual. I mean, I would advocate hopefully now, and I think some of your prior speakers and congressmen and other people are saying the workplace needs to be more understanding of caregiving, of their employers doing the caregiving responsibilities for their mother, father, their loved ones. So they need to have flexible hours, telework, other aspects I think that need to be more implemented. It would help the caregivers and release their strain and stress in dealing with caregiving duties as well as family duties and their employment duties as well.
So did you work full-time over these
Full-time.
28 years? So not part-time? You didn't
Not
scale back
part-time.
at all? Wow.
I had to scale down with the employer occasionally, and that was setting back, reducing our work hours. So that was a factor involved, and my employers accepted it, but they probably didn't like me doing that a lot. So that type. And the other mass that people don't think about it is you're pulling away from your own family. I had 3 kids and my wife, so I had to pull some of my responsibilities and dealings with my own family and caring for my mother. But I did it with devotion. I did it with love. And I'm sure all caregivers do that, all the 63 million of them out there these days. And it's increasing. I mean, I heard reports say 1 in 5, 1 in 4 individuals are caring for someone, but I feel that there's more.
So you talked about what you thought maybe employers could do more for people who are caregivers. When you were a caregiver, would you say there was anything more that the government could have done, whether it's federal, local, or state?
Well, the government at that point in time, I don't think there was both states and the federal government were that cognizant of the caregiving epidemic that started gradually increasing. I mean, some of your prior speakers said that there was like it's on the back burner. They felt
So no talk of tax credits for you? No.
So hopefully, I hear now that there are proposals for credit for caregiving that's going to get back if that's enacted, and the lowering caregiver costs, the 2 bipartisan proposals that I'm aware of, that will definitely help caregivers and bring back money to their pocketbook, but also providing them with a little bit of benefit to keep their caregiving less stressful. And I do hope they're enacted by Congress. I know they have a lot of bills to consider, but I think the caregivers, the 63 million caregivers out there, would appreciate them enacting these and implementing these as soon as possible.
What is your greatest takeaway from that experience of caregiving that I know so many watching and so many here in the room share with you?
What I advise caregivers now is to prepare early. If you have a spouse, a loved one that you anticipating maybe taking care of, plan early. Don't wait, because the longer you wait, it's going to be in a crisis mode. In the crisis modes, we generally don't do as well. It's more stressful, so I advise people. Back in my days when caregiving, there were very little resources available, written, otherwise. Of course, there was no internet back in the 80s and 90s, and I think it came out in the 2000s. But now we have the access to resources. There are agencies, even the federal government have some. And one of your speakers says there are a lot of red tape to get access to those particular programs and services. So hopefully that'll be streamlined and more understandable. One thing that I found recently that I think all caregivers should consider is my friends at AARP have a wonderful Prepare to Care guide. It's the most unique guide to help in caregiving. It's available by contacting them. It's a wonderful guide. It's a great resource, and I recommend to all of my people in my area, in the Shreveport and Bossier and surrounding area in Louisiana, to utilize this particular document. It's going to save them from reinventing the wheel.
I understand you are actually an AARP volunteer, so what do you tell folks who you advise when they come to you?
Well, when I tell them to power is, I also tell them to access the resources, not of just the AARP, but there are other agencies within their own neck of the woods to gain that insight on caregiving. But it's going to be stressful thinking what to do and how to plan, but you have particular documents and support groups. There are many throughout our wonderful country. There are many support groups for caregivers now. There used to not be, but now the caregivers are sharing their stories and sharing their aspects on caregiving that's going to benefit them in the future. But again, I love it that now caregiving is more prominent in both our state and national governments, as well as our employers and their policymakers. I think it's been on the back burner for many, many years. I remember when I was taking care of my mom, very few people understood the word caregiver. I mean, I know some of the administrations talked about it, but nothing was really said about it a lot. So luckily, it's getting more in the limelight, and hopefully more and more programs and policies, both on the federal, state, and employer base, will be implemented to benefit caregivers.
Well, Gary Calligas, thank you again for making the long trip all the way from Shreveport, Louisiana, and sharing your story and representing the population of caregivers. We appreciate you.
Thank you, Kathleen.
Thank you.
Now joining Kathleen on stage, please welcome our panel of experts. Melissa Bartlett is the SVP of Health Policy at the ERISA Industry Committee, or ERIC, which helps America's largest employers shape benefits policies before those policies shape them. Nancy Lamond is EVP and Chief Advocacy Officer at AARP, the sponsor of today's program. And Lance Robertson, a partner at Guidehouse and former Assistant Secretary for Aging at the Department of Health and Human Services. Welcome.
Welcome, Melissa, Nancy, Lance. Thank you so much for joining me this morning. Nancy, I want to start with you. AARP just recently released a new state-by-state report, not only looking at caregiving, but the enormous financial toll that it can take. What findings would you say you found to be the most urgent?
Well, I think the overwhelming finding is that 80% of all family caregivers, and there are about 63 million in this country, say that they are investing resources in taking care of their loved ones.
Well, like Gary described, what did he say, $7,000-8,000?
Absolutely,
right?
Around
a year,
$7,200 a year, and it's ongoing. It's ongoing, and we also know that it's taking a financial toll on them. As we talk to people, they're not saving as they pay this money for their loved ones. They're going into debt. They're worried about their retirement. They're worried about their health care. And I think we were very, very struck by that. We've done a lot of studies that show the strain and the challenges on family caregiving, but this really highlighted for us the financial challenges, which everybody who's preceded us talking this morning has mentioned.
Lance, back in 2017, as part of the RAISE Act, you helped craft something called the National Strategy to Support Family Caregivers. Now, I'm one of many who probably didn't even realize we had this national strategy. So would you say that you are you satisfied with the progress that has been made since then? And if not, what has prevented it from having more impact?
Yeah, great question. Hopefully everyone listening has familiarity with the RAISE Act and the 350 recommendations that came out of that with the national strategy. You'll do well on the quiz we're about to pass out. I do think, though, Kathleen, we've made great progress. Are we there yet? Of course not. Will we be there soon? I doubt it. But I do think, given the enormity of the issue we're talking about, family caregivers, this is not something that will be conquered in the next day, week, month, year. This is an ongoing, evolving issue that we all have to commit to. I do think that the RAISE Act, some of the real highlights of that work that I always will cherish is just the bipartisan approach of it. You heard today from members of Congress. This is really an apolitical issue. This is not something that has to be wrapped in politics. This is something as a country everyone is impacted by. Therefore, everyone needs to step up and play a role. I love the fact that there are 15 or more federal agencies involved. The federal government is a big partner. The federal government should not be considered the only or primary partner, but I do think they can really incentivize and push certain things forward. And, I think that despite just the natural occurrences in D.C. with administrations, we continue to see momentum moving forward. I know the current leadership at the Administration for Community Living, and speaking with them yesterday, they're getting ready to relaunch, raise, and keep it pushing forward and doing great things. So I do think we have some wonderful opportunities ahead. Everything that we hear discussed in terms of supporting caregivers has value. I do think, though, this is the time where we have to really take the conversation to the next level. Based on the data and what we know, how do we then wrap around our efforts in a way that are much more technology-driven, innovative, creative? How can we really bend the curve in a positive way that isn't just reliant on what we have traditionally come across as solutions?
Now, Melissa, employers are very much a part of this discussion because some 2/3 of caregivers actually have jobs. Isn't that amazing? As they are taking care of their loved ones. Yet only about 1/4 of workers in the United States have paid leave. So when employers want to do more to help their workers who are in this pinch, what roadblocks stand in their way?
So thank you for having me, by the way. I'm with the ERISA Industry Committee, otherwise known as ERIC, and our member companies are the largest employers in the country. They have benefit designs for retirement, healthcare, welfare benefits for a nationwide workforce. So clearly they are trying to meet the needs of their workers in terms of recruitment and retention, keeping them happy, keeping them healthy, and supporting them as caregivers. And so the key question here is, and paid leave's a component perhaps of how they design their overall benefit program to meet those needs. But I think the key question is how can employers afford not to do anything on caregiving support when you think about that, right? It has significant impacts, like I said, on retention, engagement, productivity. These are all things that employers know and recognize and want to be part of the solution. And I'll say there was a Mercer 2025 report, since you mentioned the 2/3. These numbers to me were just staggering, that caregivers represent about 47% of employees in the U.S. That was from a Mercer, did a report this year, 2025. Roughly half of the caregivers really, are stressed in everyday life of those employees, about 49% of employees, and about the same, feel the same stress most days at work. 9 in 10, so 86% have delayed their own health care in the past 12 months. Also, like you said, 2/3 or 69% say they're thriving in their current role, but they're keen to pursue further sort of training opportunities. So there is an investment component there that employers have in their employees, right? They want to stay employed, they want to grow in their professional life, but they're balancing it with their personal life as well. And so, like I said, employers, what our large members have done is there's no one solution for all employers. What they need to do is have as much flexibility as they can so that they can listen to their employees and design the benefit that their employees need regardless of where they are in the country. And that's a whole host of solutions. I think you touched on technology and AI and the promise that has. Obviously, telehealth. Right. We've seen an explosion in the use of telehealth to meet the worker or the worker's family where it's best for them to access care, potentially. There's obviously all kinds of financial and work flexibilities that employers are implementing today, whether it's hybrid work, remote work, some tied to folks that are new parents, some tied to folks who have recently encountered elderly caregiving situations in their lives. Large employers have that flexibility to meet the employees where their need is, but they need it. They need to protect it, and they need the room to sort of build those benefit designs around their particular workforce.
Nancy, speaking of solutions, we heard the lawmakers at the top of the show. They had a lot of different ideas. It does sound like there is increasingly a bipartisan consensus on this. Is this something new? If so, what has changed? And if this is a new momentum, then how do we seize this to bring these measures across the finish line?
Well, we're seeing increased interest and activity now at the federal level. About 12 years ago, AARP did something most big organizations never do, and that's we went and talked to thousands of our members about their lives. And what we found was family caregiving was a huge issue. And it wasn't an issue that came up in our polling and things like that at the time, because people weren't talking about it very much. And so we put together a plan to begin in the states. Our first big victory was in Lance's home state of Oklahoma, where we passed the CARE Act, which requires hospitals to identify caregivers as somebody comes in and is later discharged. And over the years, we've seen bipartisan, bicameral support across the country, red states, blue states. And we were encouraged by this. And now, thanks to Lance and his team starting the work on the RAISE Act and others, we've seen more and more interest on the part of members of Congress. You saw it at the beginning of this program. I think we're high on the awareness scale. People understand family caregivers. There are millions of them. Most of us in this room probably are or getting ready to be one. Now what we have to do is push for action at the federal level in order to help family caregivers in the category of providing resources, perhaps technology, things like telehealth, but also helping them with the financial burdens. And at least two pieces of legislation that we support have been mentioned today, the caregiver tax credit and a proposal that it would allow people to use their HSAs or FSAs to pay for caregiving expenses.
Lance, what do you think about that idea, the tax incentives or tax credits that we've heard a lot about today? Do you think that those go far enough in making a meaningful difference, or do we need to look at changes that are broader and more systemic?
Certainly, it's one more tool in the toolkit. It's not the solution, but it can be helpful. And I do think back to what Nancy was commenting, the appetite within Congress, and then how do we make sure that as a federal partner, the federal partner is really leaning in here. We've seen, of course, back in the day, the establishment of the National Family Care Support Program, the RAISE Act. We've seen some legislative opportunities, but for me, it really, though, and I'm sure I'm speaking to the choir here, for me, it's really about how do we get better appropriations to support this. You know, that's the struggle. I think we probably all acknowledge we continue to live in an ageist society where at the end of the day, we're just kind of nibbling around the edges of this issue. And if we really wanted Congress to step up, I'm grateful for what we're seeing, but I would love to see just an enormous appropriations commitment that says, you know what, this caregiver issue is so profoundly critical to our country that to really prop up that long-term support piece that we're not paying for, as members of Congress, we believe we need to better invest in respite and coalitions and all the sorts of things that are out there that I think could help, at the end of the day, drive better financial support for the caregiver.
Melissa, what about the HSAs and FSAs? They're employer-sponsored. Do employers think that would be great to let, instead of it going to, take care of some of your own expenses or your children's, use it for taking care of an aging parent, an aging uncle or aunt or other family member?
Absolutely. And I'll say, like AARP, we are very supportive of legislative efforts on the Hill to provide, some mitigation of the financial strain that employees have, whether it's in the form of tax credits for caregivers to use towards the care of their loved ones or themselves, or, the IRS came out with guidance. It doesn't even have to be done legislatively, which is common sense, which says if an employer is using a care.com type tool or a patient navigator type tool to help their employees find care, that they shouldn't. It's basically a clarification of how the tax is calculated, whether it's tax imputed or not. But essentially, at the end of the day, the guidance would give more flexibility to employers to be able to cover that benefit and give people access to this kind of navigation tools. All of these things are very common sense. HSA dollars is another thing that's totally common sense. HSAs were created in the Medicare Modernization Act over 20 years ago. At that time, I was working on Capitol Hill, and I'll tell you how far we've come in terms of advances in care and technology. I worked for a committee, they issued me a BlackBerry, and it was the size of a pager. And that was primarily how I did my emails and communications with folks. So I'd be walking to a meeting, and I got really good with one thumb. I'm not surprised it has arthritis now. But all of that said, And I was so mad when they took it away and I had to go to a bigger BlackBerry. And then they took away the BlackBerry, right? So the point is when this was created, lawmakers aren't perfect and they're looking at sort of the evidence in front of them at the time. And that's why employers have more flexibility to test things and do things. But unfortunately, when it comes to HSAs, there are tax rules, there are rules in place that were put in place when the HSAs were sort of born as part of the Medicare Modernization Act. And so it's a snapshot in time. Your ability to really leverage those HSA dollars as a worker is hampered by some of these outdated sort of rules. And so
Congress has to step in.
Congress has to step in, unfortunately, because they would have never envisioned probably being able to use for HSA, a high deductible plan with HSAs coupled could provide first dollar coverage for telehealth services. Thankfully, Congress recognized that's a really important thing and it's working really well. So they made that permanent. They made that fix permanent this year. There's so many more fixes to the HSA flexibility and modernization that need to occur. One of them is the ability to use those dollars towards caregiving needs. 100% agree. 100% agree with Nancy and Lance.
Nancy, America's caregivers, and this is a pretty striking figure, provide some, and I'm sure you know this, some $600 billion in unpaid care. $600 billion every year. I mean, that's astonishing. And I know AARP has advocated that they be recognized as part of America's care economy. Why is that important? What kind of a difference would that make, and what steps do we need to take to make that happen?
Well, I believe AARP believes that family caregivers are the new provider care in the medical system. And it's important to recognize them in a number of ways. One is to provide the kind of information resources that people need in order to help their loved ones. Second, more and more caregivers are providing medical tasks in the home. I tell this story. My husband had ALS, and by the way, anybody who thinks you have to have girls to take care of you, sons are good too. My two sons and I, and paid family caregivers, took care of my husband. He had a feeding tube installed but didn't use it right away. And so we got training about a year before. And when it came to actually helping him, we ended up using a YouTube video to show us how to do it. Now, I'm a big fan of YouTube, but it probably isn't the way we should be training people to do medical tasks in the home. So recognizing caregivers, and CMS now does, to provide support to doctors, nurses, to show them how to use this equipment is hugely important. And then the fact of the matter is everybody, I think, this morning has mentioned that we're doing things here and there. Mm-hmm. We're not addressing what is a huge challenge on the horizon. And the importance of family caregivers in not only that solution, but also in the application of anything that's enacted is going to be crucially important.
So not only can sons be great caregivers, but so can grandsons, right, Lance? You were the caregiver for your grandparents, who raised you.
In my case, sons.
Yeah, well, but it's pretty astonishing. I mean, you were a young adult, and figures show that today 12 to 18% of caregivers, are younger adults. So, are you optimistic, looking where we stand today and how things have changed, that the way forward is going to be easier for them today than it was for you decades ago?
Oh, certainly, yeah. I mean, I think now, thinking back 30 years ago when I was a caregiver, very little information in place and really not an acceptance for reaching out for help. It was sort of just an expectation that you took care of it. It was your family. And nowadays, as we all know, there are quite a few resources out there. Society is better understanding, embracing, supporting caregivers. So certainly I think the pathway can be better. Doesn't make it easier necessarily, but at least I think a lot of caregivers today of all ages do have access to a lot more resources and information. I think, though, we all best learn from others and their experiences. So I also hope that we can continue to see, better connectedness across the caregiving network, so that as people are going through a situation like that, they're encountering, fellow community members or church members or wherever their social network's at who have gone through it, who can also step in. And I think, again, that is much more acceptable now and common than it was, back in the 90s.
Melissa, you've said several times this morning about how employers the workplace can be great testing ground for new ideas. Do we need any policy changes to make that easier?
I would say probably the HSA policy changes, very important. The fact that we now have first dollar coverage of telehealth, if you'd asked me 6 months ago before that bill passed, I would have said, do that right away. But I think that if anything, the danger is that folks may try to over-regulate and get in this space. And then suddenly employers, which is what we've unfortunately, I think, seen in a bit with the paid leave space, right, where you have states all sort of popping up and doing their own sort of paid leave programs, when employers may already be offering a paid leave program that makes sense for their workforce. Now they're looking at a patchwork of different requirements. And so it's not that they don't want to do paid leave, they are doing paid leave, it's just making it incredibly hard to sort of turn the dials to be, compliant with whatever state may have their own sense of what that should look like. So I think preserving the flexibility for large employers to offer nationwide benefits is key. And again, they have their own sort of mandate, a business mandate to do this, because they can't afford not to do it. They need the workforce, and they've invested in the workforce, and they want to keep the workforce. And so it's funny you asked if it's changed since Lance was a caregiver. So I'm a sandwich person, right? And that doesn't mean I just don't like salads. I'm actually a sandwich caregiver. I have a 10-year-old daughter, and I had a mother who passed this fall from MS. She had MS for 25 years. She died in her home, my childhood home, because my dad has a patchwork of caregiving assistants. My dad being her primary caregiver for most of the time that the disease progressed. My dad himself, who's in his late 70s, was diagnosed last year with Parkinson's. So in the last year since my mom has died, he also cannot now be left alone in the house, but he insists that he's going to die in his home. And so her caregiver that came in to help her now comes in on a daily basis to help him. But what do you do when that caregiver gets sick? So this caregiver had breast cancer and had to have some medical interventions. So then it was on me to come home and stay with my dad. Fortunately, my employer said, you know what, do it, we support you, you can work remotely. And that's the kind of interventions I think we have now, in addition to the telehealth and HSAs and all these things, the employer trusting their employees and investing in their employees in a way that says, we want to keep you happy, we want to meet you where your needs are, tell us what you need. And it's, there's a lot of employers that are doing employer support groups and caregiving training webinars and all of those important internal supports. But I think it's really, and what you'll see from this Mercer study I mentioned, the highest demand that workers have when it comes to their employers on how, to make this work is the flexibility, the flexible work location, the flex hours, and, obviously the training.
And did I get a sign that we have questions? All right.
Sure do. I have an audience question from
So these were submitted earlier.
Anya. What are the best sources of information for families right now? Is that area agencies on aging, perhaps state entities, etc.?
And the question is?
Best sources.
What are the best sources of information for families right now? Is that area agencies for aging or perhaps state entities, etc.?
Who wants to take that?
Yeah, a couple of people mentioned earlier, AARP has a wide range of resources. If you come to our website, in addition to Prepare for Care, which I think Gary mentioned, we have a number of resources. We also know how important it is to get local information. And so we have a partnership with United Way of America, and in almost 100 cities now and soon to be expanded, we have a partnership with 211, where if you call, you're able to be directed to resources in the community. And we urge folks, also the area agencies on aging, and many of the hospitals in the community, particularly in rural communities, are available to provide some kind of basic information. The other thing, I don't know if you found this with MS and Parkinson's community, but I found the ALS Association had some very specific guidance for dealing with someone with that particular disease, and I think that's very important. I remember we had some information on our website that was really geared to folks who we're treating people with Alzheimer's and worried about them wandering away, et cetera. And that's not a problem if you're dealing with people who can't move. And so it's really important, I think, to get the general information. AARP is a terrific resource for that, but also to look to other channels as well.
Thank you. More questions?
One more from Dana. A person with heavy care needs who is cared for at home needs 3 shifts of home care workers plus some skilled services. This is an immense cost. Why not make congregate living and nursing homes pleasant places where people can have companionship and high quality care with savings from health workers being able to take care of multiple residents?
Lance?
Well, that's a loaded question. and I do think, I mean, the person asking the question has obviously an obvious interest in better seeing congregate options, and I think more of those are coming online. They're slow, and I do think that the majority of us still understand the nursing home industry in general is not as fondly received for your care option as a community-based option would be. But you know, we are seeing more and more of that, and in some cases it's because if you think about some of the population and groups we serve generally across the country, not just older adults, but people with different sorts of disabilities also require similar types of care and have different types of care situations that can also be a companion option. So I don't think there's a way to sort of all of a sudden merge the system into a single type of congregate care setting, but that can always be an add-on, such as like adult day. You know, there are a lot of adult day centers across the country, and that can be a nice option during core hours of a work day that offers some respite and then some great socialization.
We just have a couple of minutes left. I'd like to give you each, Nancy, starting with you, maybe a chance to share your final thoughts as you look forward. You know, I know we've come a long ways, caregiving in the last 10 years. Are you optimistic, hopeful, concerned?
I'm always hopeful, and I'm always optimistic, and I think gatherings like this, the opportunity to hear ideas people have and willingness to get behind them is encouraging. And anybody who's in the room or on the line, we'd be happy to have you help us advocate on this issue.
Lance?
Thank you.
Yeah, absolutely. I would say that my challenge really becomes, at the end of the day, a personal one, because we over-leverage what's the federal government's responsibility, what is the public sector's responsibility, all these wonderful community-based organizations that are often poorly funded and not properly staffed. Those are all pieces, but at the end of the day, the best option is an individual by individual, household by household approach. So my question, my challenge, my closing comment would be, what are you doing to sort of protect your family from what inevitably will become a caregiver situation in your family? Are you having those advanced conversations now? Are you, they can be a little painful, but how are you making sure that your family is prepared and ready? As our caregiver said, if you take the steps to do that now, your family's going to be in a better place. And if we could do that, Robertson household and on down the line, we're going to be in a better place than just relying on others doing this for us.
Melissa?
Yeah, I think it's an interesting question, because I believe, for several decades now, we've known that there would be this baby boomer population coming. And I think policymakers have generally approached it as a federal payer reimbursement healthcare delivery question. How are we going to provide healthcare services in an affordable way to that many more people once they retire? What was kind of missing from the conversation, although there have been sort of starts and stops around things like money follows the person and community-based home and community-based services, albeit in Medicaid specifically, is really this concept of how are we going to take care of the people and the caregiving aspect when they all do retire and they do have children or grandchildren they have to rely on, and then how do we support those people to help them? It's a big and complicated question that I'm very encouraged to see lawmakers and stakeholders of all sides wanting to come together and try to build in the right incentives and the flexibilities to allow employers or federal programs to really address this, whether it's funding some things or giving employers the flexibility. But I guess that's where I see the movement, and I'm encouraged by that. I don't think we're going to solve it overnight. Unfortunately, there are a lot of people that are suffering because of that. I mean, some of these questions, like what do you do when you need 3 shifts
and you can't afford private care in the home, and your father won't go to assisted living. What do you do? You know, so going to a community-based service and asking for help, leveraging, go to your employer, go to your HR department if you're working and you're a caregiver and say, what can you help me find? They will offer navigation services for you. They will provide you with community services that might be appropriate where you live that you can tap into. They may work with you on your work schedule or your work hours. And you know, there's some of these programs you talked about, like they just didn't exist like a few years ago, but you know, employers reserving seats at childcare centers and adult daycare centers. So, you know, don't be shy, I guess, and I'm glad to see more and more people being more empowered to really talk about caregiving. That it's not an insular family issue anymore. It really is a community issue. It really is an employment issue. It really is a higher health policy issue.
Well, Melissa, Nancy, Lance, thank you so much. That brings us to the end of our program today. Thank you to all of our fabulous speakers. Thank you to folks watching online, and thank you to everyone here in the room. If anyone missed, and thank you to our sponsor, AARP, for making this all possible. If you happen to miss anything, or you're in the room like, I missed what that person said earlier, this entire program will be available online at thehill.com. So thank you all. Have a wonderful day, and stay warm out there.
Thank you.
Take care.